Hey everybody, my name is John DePietro, and I want to welcome you to this special edition of My Life with Kenny Rogers. And the best part for you, our viewers, is that this is not about my life with Kenny Rogers, but it's the life of our special guest, Chuck Jacobs, who had a 40-year career with Kenny. Now, I want to tell you this right up front. This is one of a series of special commemorative videos that we're putting together with people who worked with Kenny in one way, shape, or form, whether it was in their band, whether it was in their crew, whether it was their bus driver, whether it was the guys who got the choirs for the famous Christmas shows. But all aspects of Kenny's lives are being of Kenny's life is being looked at in these series. So if you like them, if you want to get a hold of them, then right down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there's a little red button that says subscribe. So hit that subscribe button, and what'll happen is that every time a new video comes out, you'll be notified. Remember, this is a special offer, not available in stores. So with that being said, let's welcome our special guest, Chuck Jacobs. Chuck, welcome to a show about you.
Hello, hello, hello.
How you doing, buddy?
I mentioned this earlier, John. I think that what you're doing is a great service, and it will be a historical archive of all these stories, which I think for the Kenny Rogers fans, it's going to be really, really an asset. So I appreciate that you're doing it, and you're doing a great job.
Great. And you know what we wanted to do was kind of get the behind the scenes story, stuff that doesn't appear on the album jacket or doesn't appear on any of the PR pieces, because there are parts of Kenny's life, really just the touring part. And that's all I can talk about is the touring part. You know, backstage moments or that type thing that are kind of special that the public would say, well, that's very interesting. And it seems like every member of the family, the quote unquote family that I talked to, has a little story that, you know, other members of the family didn't even know about. So hopefully you'll be able to provide some of that impetus. And the interesting part about what you're providing, you're going to be providing it yourself because you're doing a book on your life with Kenny Rogers.
Well, that's true. It's called 40 Years Behind the Legend. I think that's what I'm calling it. It's always in a little bit of a flux until you finally finalize it. But I think that's what it is. I think I have a website going on that too. Something like 40 Years Behind the Legend or 40yearswiththelegend.com. One of those two. I want to do a small correction. It's not a big deal, but you've said this before in other interviews, and that is that we're dealing with the family, and it is the family, but we should be clear, it's the musical family. I don't think that we have the actual physical family, which are great people too. And I would actually love it.
We're working on that.
That'd be great. Randy and Sandy, etc. Yeah. And I don't know, did you know that Randy and Sandy Rogers are twins?
I didn't know that. I didn't know that, but I do know that Sandy is watching these because she likes them.
I love Sandy.
Put the like down, and we're trying to reach her to actually, I've put the invitation out saying, Sandy, I want you to be part of this because Leland's son, Dan, is part of it already. And, you know, maybe we can find Paul or find Lenny or Lanny are Lenny and Lanny the same person?
Lenny is Lenny Rogers.
Yeah.
And Lanny is Lanny, last name goes on my head right
Lanny
now.
Landers.
Lanny Landers was the, he had several roles in our group. From first when he joined, and I joined in '79, he was the merchandise person. And then he developed into more of the crew member with the equipment. And then he was a monitor mixer. And then later on, he became an interest in doing rigging, where you set the points where they they hang the speakers and lights from in the ceilings of arenas. That's called a rigger. And that's what he mainly did for us until he retired from us and went with
Garth Brooks,
a young guy named Garth Brooks, and was his rigger for many years as well.
Yeah.
So Lanny is a great guy. if you get a chance to talk to him, ask him about him building his own house. He built his house.
Oh, really?
In Mount Juliet and or Hermitage, I think it was. And he's a talented guy, really is. The one other funny little nuance that I want to mention, I mentioned that Sandy and Randy are twins, and that's in Kenny's immediate siblings.
Oh.
But a generation down, Leland's sons, Paul Rogers, who used to work with, and Paula, they're also twins. And then, of course, you know that Kenny's wife, Wanda, and Tanya are twins. Yep. And then he has twin boys.
So there's
a lot of twins in that family.
On both sides of the family.
Yeah, it's quite amazing.
That's interesting.
But I digress, and I think that what you're doing is great. If you could get a hold of Sandy and Randy and do it, it might be fun to have both of them. That might be
exactly.
Unique.
Yeah. Exactly. So
Randy actually, just another nuance is that Randy was the physical star in the video 20 years ago because he looked like Kenny 20 years previous.
And they were not that far apart.
That's right. It's really
that's funny. The 20 years ago video. Now, you know, at one of the shows that we did down at the Villages, it was either Randy or Roy must have been Randy that was
well, it's likely that both of them were there, but yeah.
Yeah, because Gene Roy couldn't get him tickets, so he and I were backstage chewing.
It's crazy. It got so busy there that we couldn't get tickets. Yeah. My brother has a house in the Villages too. Brother Rod, who plays drums. My other brother Dan plays trumpet. Yeah. Interesting.
Did you have another brother named Daryl too?
No, not me.
You know, but my brother Daryl, my other brother.
That wasn't that the. Oh, what was that?
We've pretty much talked about everything except what we're supposed to be talking about. But
we do a good job of that.
So Chuck, we always talk about 40 years with Chuck, but give us your background, your Michigan background, and how you ended up in Florida via Burbank. But more importantly, how you ended up with Kenny, which is really a New York, New Jersey connection too, right?
That's right. I grew up in northern Michigan. My family was all musical and had a Dixieland group. They were my nearest sibling is my brother Rod, who plays drums, and he's 7 years older than I. And then my brother Dan played trumpet. My mother played piano and Dixieland piano, and my sister played clarinet and sang. They had a Dixieland group in northern Michigan. They were quite renowned in the area. In fact, you've heard of the Mackinac Bridge. Mm-hmm. They actually played the day that bridge was opened. They played as a celebration for that. It was kind of an interesting little tidbit. But I grew up there, and early on, I was just sort of bitten by the music bug. And I call it a bug because in a way it's a curse, because music is, when you have it as your life goal, which is what happened for me, you don't want to do anything else. And so sometimes that doesn't do well for raising families and having income and stuff like that, because you don't always make money. You do it because you love it. Yeah. And so in Michigan, in the 60s, I was with a regional successful group that had records out, and it was fun having those out and we'd open up for Bob Seger and the group that later became Grand Funk Railroad, etc.
So you got to play We've Got Tonight for both Bob Seger and Kenny.
Well, not quite, because he didn't have that song out yet, but in the 60s. But but ironically, we did a jam session up in Michigan and in later years after I was with Kenny, and the guitar player that played in the Silver Bullet Band, Drew Abbott, was a good friend of mine. And when we did this jam session in northern Michigan, he said, well, at least we know one song we can play together. And that was We Got Tonight. But in growing up in Michigan, I went through different kind of bands and ended up in a band in the early 80s. No, sorry, in the early 70s, 73, I think it was, with a band that was an R&B band. You did an interview with Edgar Struble, and he and I joined this band called Chopper, which was so it was a R&B horn band. and it was a really hot band, and everybody loved it. And you'll see tidbits on Facebook and the web about Chopper being, really favored and admired by many. But it was mainly a club band, a nightclub, and we played all over Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, all the Midwest, and then on the East Coast on New Jersey shore. We did a lot down out there too.
Now we casually refer to Edgar Struble, but he really plays a major role in my partnership in your life many years later.
That's right, in my getting with Kenny. So in that group, Chopper, Edgar, and I were close friends, and then both of us left the group in 1975. And we sort of bounced around for a few months, and Edgar, in the beginning of 76, January 76, he moved to Nashville. Well, he went to Nashville to sort of pursue whatever he could find out there. I moved to New York City and played a jazz trio, the Roy Merriweather Trio. And so I was out in New York, in Manhattan, living there, and with my wife, Susan. And Edgar was down in Nashville and made a relationship with 3 guys who later became the group that Kenny hired, which was called Turning Point at that time. And that was Bobby Daniels, Gene Golden, and Steve Glassmeyer, and a guitar player named T.G. Ingalls.
Yep.
Edgar went down there, and as he relates in his interview with you, he just sort of sat in with those guys a lot. And then when Kenny hired that group, a few months later, Edgar had left Nashville and then came back and was doing a job at Ramada Inn down there. And just about the time that gig at Ramada Inn ran out for him, he got a call from Bobby Daniels saying, "Hey, Kenny wants to add another player to the group." And because Edgar played keyboards and guitar and congas and harmonica and clavinet, which is a neat story that he relates about. They asked him, "Hey, do you play clavinet?" He said, "Oh yeah, sure."
He had never seen one.
He said it's got keys, and I figured I could figure out how to play it, and so he did. And he joined that group in I think the fall of 1976.
Here's the thing, Chuck. You were lucky that you played one instrument and you specialized in bass.
And
the other guys, like I was told that Kenny wanted to hire utility players that could do 2 or 3 instruments. And when Warren Hartman was hired, because of his composing background, that type of thing, Kenny asked him, "Have you ever done so-and-so?" And Warren said, yeah, which he hadn't done, but he figured, well, if it's got to do with music, I can do it. Just like Edgar says, well, you know what? If it's got keys on it, I can play it.
That's right. I think that fits in a lot of fields of employment. Is that somebody says, "Can you do such and such?"
Oh,
you
yeah.
always say yes.
Yep, exactly.
But it was funny. During the 76 is when Edgar joined Kenny, and then as time progressed, I was living in New York, and I, of course, admired and was proud of Edgar for having gotten with Kenny, and I thought it was really neat. But it wasn't my cup of tea. I was playing jazz, and I was what you call a jazz snob. I looked down on
any other piece,
which I've certainly learned to grow from that. And so I thought it was great that he was doing it, but it wasn't for me. It wasn't something I'd want to do. And as it happened, they had a keyboard player, Gene Golden, who played bass with his left hand on the keys.
Yeah.
And they were perfectly satisfied with it. But as you mentioned earlier, when Kenny said, "I want to hire people that can do more than one thing," it's interesting. As you mentioned that, I thought back and I thought, well, he hired me and I only did one thing, and that was play bass. And I thought it's an interesting kind of way it fits together, because Kenny was a bass player, had previously been a bass player.
You think there was a little bit of affinity that?
Yeah, so maybe there was some kind of affinity relationship in that. Well, I want somebody that just plays bass, So Garth Shaw, who was our road manager early on, mentioned something that I thought was very praiseworthy, in that he said, because Kenny was a bass player, you got to give Chuck some kudos, because Kenny hired someone that did what he used to do,
He did it well.
So that was kind of a nice thing for Garth to say. So anyway, getting back to how I sort of got into the group, Edgar would come up in the Northeast with Kenny, and if I didn't have a job with the jazz trio, he'd invite us, my wife and I, out to see the band and visit with him. And I did that several times and got to know the other guys in the group. And because they didn't have a bass player, like I said, sometimes I'd take my bass along, and at sound checks I would jam with them, and got to know the guys personally and musically, you know.
So you're one of those guys that, like, if you go to a baseball game, you put on a uniform and bring a glove with you, right? Well, we're going to a concert tonight. I might as well bring my bass along in case
That's right.
somebody gets hurt and I have to stand in, right?
It's one of those things that you just do, you know.
That's too funny.
So one time they were playing a racetrack in northern New Jersey, right across the bridge from New York City, Manhattan. And actually in my book, I've got a picture of Edgar and me at that racetrack. It's a really unique picture.
Probably, was it Meadowlands? Could have been Meadowlands.
That's probably what it was. Yeah. You're probably right. And so as it happened, I brought my bass with me, and Randy, it was a guitar player. Randy Dorman was the guitar player, and up to Kenny's retirement was the guitar player for the group. Yeah. And
it was a jazz guy too, right?
He was a real jazzer, and so we sort of had an instant bond, you know. And he said, why don't you come back to the hotel and we'll jam after the show? So my wife Susan and I drove and followed them back to the hotel they were staying at. Went to Randy's room and set up a small amplifier, and he had his guitar, and we just sort of played jazz tunes until wee hours in the morning, you know, and maybe 2, 3 in the morning, really. But we had a really good time. And
who happened to be in the next room, Chuck?
Well, as it happened, the person in the room next door who could hear everything through the walls was Kenny Rogers, and he was renowned for not being happy when there were noises that kept him awake at night when he was trying to sleep in a hotel room. And
renowned.
So, yeah, he was. So fortunately, he didn't make any phone calls. So we didn't know this at the time, of course. We later found this out, but we probably assumed that he sort of liked what he heard, because he was a real jazz aficionado as well.
Right.
And he enjoyed songs such as the ones we were playing. And so in later years, when I did end up getting the offer to come with the band, we sort of joked that was sort of my audition, you know, because I never really did an audition. They just they called me up and said, hey, do you want to join the group? Well, I'm skipping a step there, and that was I was playing this jazz group, as I told you, and we did a demo for Columbia Records in New York, and I thought for sure that was going to be the stepping stone to an album, and things were going to really go well for the group, because I really thought that we were doing well, and we did do well. The audiences and the live performances that we did loved what we did, and but it didn't translate to recording. It was a little too drawn out. Sometimes jazz performances, you can get extended solos, and when you're live, people really get into that. But on a recording, it has to be more succinct. And I didn't really understand that at the time. And honestly, that was one of the things I learned when I joined Kenny. It was like, there's a reason to have this here and this here. And when I talk on stage, when he talks on stage, I realized from listening to him that every syllable was planned out, and it got a certain reaction from the audience. So I looked back at a demo I did with the jazz group and realized that's what was missing. We didn't gel. Well, we gelled, but we didn't say what we had to say in a smaller amount of time. So anyway, long story short, Columbia passed on hiring the group, and I was a little bit in limbo or mystery of, do I want to keep doing this or not, you know? So I was talking to my brother, who at that time was doing personal counseling, and he said, you know, maybe you ought to call the guys and strengthen the line of communication with the Kenny Rogers group. So I said, well, it's not a bad idea. I don't know if I want to do that, but not a bad idea. So I ended up calling up Bobby Daniels. And I said, hey, Bobby, who was sort of the spokesman for the group at that time.
Yeah.
And I said, Bobby, I said, I don't know if I would be the guy or even if I would really be interested, but if you ever decide to actually add a physical bass player, I'd like to throw my hat in the ring. It was as simple as that. It was not, hey, can I have a job or something like that. It was just like, maybe it would be good.
Did you wear that commemorative hat? Is that the hat that you have on now that you were going to throw in the ring?
That's right. It was. Now, I'm not going to take it off because you'd see how my voluminous amount of hair on my head. But anyway, so ironically, that was early December of 2000, 2000, here we go, 1978. And then, and so at Christmas time, we always went, my wife and I always went to her family's home in Michigan, right north of South Bend. And so we ended up there and we were there for Christmas. And so, again, just the time frame, beginning of December is when I called Bobby and just said that. And he said, well, I don't think we have any plans on that, any bass player, but, you know, I'll keep your name in mind for sure. So right after Christmas, in between Christmas and New Year's, I got a call from Edgar Struble, who said, you know what? They want to add a bass player and they want you to come join the band. And I said, what? I was like really shocked. And he said, yeah, Kenny's going to be opening as the headliner act, the top act at Riviera Casino in Vegas in January, and late January, third week of January. And he said, because he's going to have an orchestra backing him there. At that time, they had a large orchestra. They had, I don't know, they had maybe 20 strings and probably 14 horns or so. They had a harp. They had a percussionist with a timpani. It was a big orchestra. And he said, I don't want to just go in and have a keyboard playing bass. I want to have a real bass player. So they called me and asked me if I wanted to do it. And I said, well, Edgar, I said, geez whiz, I'm really honored and appreciative, but I have to think it over. Is that okay? And most people would say, well, why'd you have to think over, you know? And we go back to the fact that I was playing jazz in a jazz trio, which had always been my dream, and I really enjoyed it. So that night, I said, can I give you an answer tomorrow? And he said, sure, no problem. So overnight, I sat down with my wife, and we talked about how it might change or affect our lives to do this job. I'd be certainly playing a music that wasn't necessarily my favorite type of music, but it's still music, you know.
And it's money.
And I love doing the jazz trio, but I'd never made hardly any money doing that. I mean, I made enough to barely get by, but not enough to think about maybe buying a house or having a family and that kind of things. And all that's part of, and again, I was 20, I think I was 29 then.
Yeah. And
so what do you think about those things? So long story short, I called Edgar back the next day, said, I'd love to do it. And so let's talk about how to get together, the logistics of it, which was sort of another story that's not worth talking about. But suffice it to say that 3 weeks later, I flew out to Vegas to join up with the group and start the first show in Las Vegas with virtually no rehearsal. We had a sound check and then a rehearsal for the horns because the arranger had horns and orchestra because the arranger had written all these arrangements and he wanted to make sure they sounded good. So we mainly had the rehearsal to see what the orchestra would sound like, and I sort of went in with it, you know. And then we did our first show that night and just sort of jumped in with both feet, you know.
Never looked back.
There's a funny story about that. And when I got the tape to learn the songs, before every song, Bobby Daniels would click his sticks. You've heard this before, to count off 1, 2, 3, 4, clicking his sticks, and you know where it is. There was one song on there that I didn't hear any click sticks, you know, sticks clicking, and that was Lucille. And all I heard on the tape as I was learning the songs was the first note would be the bass starting the song. Boom, boom, you know. And so then everybody would join in. So what would you assume? I assumed, well, the bass must be starting this and everybody joins in, you know. So we're doing the show. We came to the spot in the show where Lucille was going to be. And I looked to my left and I looked to my right to see if everybody was looking at me because I was going to start it, you know. We never talked about this because we didn't run the song in the rehearsals. And so I thought, well, I guess I ought to start the song. So I go, booms, and everybody sort of jumped like this, and then they all jumped in and started playing. And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. But we got through the song, everything went fine. And then after the show, the guys back in the dressing room sort of jokingly said, what the heck were you doing? And I said, well, on the tape, I heard this. I never heard any count off, no sticks clicking. And they said, oh, and they laughed, all the laugh. Turns out that they had a system where Bobby, on that song, would take his sticks and do what they called an air count. It was 1, 2, 3, like this, with his stick in the air. You didn't hear anything, and then everybody would come in. So it became a little bit of an inside joke through the years that Chuck was taking over, you know.
Okay, so Chuck, you said a couple times in that last segment, you said, so I jumped right in without a rehearsal.
Right.
Okay. Now, fast forward 40 years. Tell us about the jump heard around the world.
Well, it was almost 40 years, a little less, but that was it's interesting you bring that up because I sort of sometimes forget to mention this. One of the most unique performances that we did was at a festival, the largest rock and roll for basically music festival in the planet, is called Glastonbury, and it's in Glastonbury, England. And it's an arts festival, but it's become renowned for being the biggest music festival. So Kenny was invited to play there on a I don't remember if it was a Saturday, but it was an afternoon performance. The night before, on that same stage, the main stage, there were several stages, and on the main stage, the Rolling Stones had performed. So that was quite a thrill in and of itself to perform on the same stage, even though 12 hours later.
Yeah.
So we went out, and here's this group of people, young people, old people. It was just a
lot of people.
Multitude of people. I think they said 130,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
And so funny, two friends of mine knew that I was going to be playing there from LA. It said they always wanted to come to Glastonbury. They actually flew over. So here they are in the audience too, two friends of mine. But we did the show and the audience just loved it. And they sang every word to every song. It was just blew us away how much they knew Kenny and knew all the songs, etc. And the last song of the show was Islands in the Stream. And at the very end of that, well, we end the song and then we play an instrumental version of it to walk as Kenny walks off.
Yeah.
And so at the very end of the song, the last note, we normally just hold the note and the drummer Mike cuts it off. So what I did though is I sort of jumped up on his drum riser.
Riser.
3 foot or so, and we're playing the last note, and then when the last note ends, I jumped off the stage to end the note, and my I think at that time 64-year-old knees supported me. Luckily, you can actually see that jump on, let's see, chuckjacobs.com. I think I have that video on the very front of that website, so it's kind
jump heard around the world. Now, interesting that you mentioned the risers back there, that you jumped up on Mike's risers. And interestingly, you had the honor to perform with all 3 of Kenny's drummers.
Well, that's a good point, isn't it? The first drummer, Bobby Daniels, who you've interviewed already, was a fantastic drummer, and I always called him a show drummer, as opposed to a studio drummer or other kind of drummers. A show drummer really pays attention to what's going on in the show. He had history of playing with groups like the Drifters and others, and so he paid attention to the singer, and if the singer was doing something, let's say he accented something with his hand movement, Bobby would hit a cymbal for that, and it was like he was into it, and and he really made the show really happen more than any other drummers that we actually had another drummer audition for the group after Bobby, and he was a great drummer, but he was more of a studio drummer, and he didn't fit the live show, and that's what we were used to with Bobby. And he was a great drummer though, and he then when he decided to leave the group, we found a drummer that we had worked with in other groups. Lynn Hammond had worked with us as an opening act with Susan Anton in the early 80s. In fact, went to Australia with us to play over there. I'm sorry, not Australia, but South Africa. And then in years later, Lynn went with Frankie Valli in the Four Seasons. So he was one of the seasons. I think he was autumn. I can't remember for sure. But anyway, when we needed to have another drummer, Lynn came on, and he really prepared well. He always did. And he actually, go ahead.
So here's why I need to stop you here. And we'll talk about Zimmerman in just a minute. But when you said I walked up on the riser, okay. Now, when I interviewed Lynn yesterday, he told me that one day that when the show was over, he was on a 3-foot riser, and then you were a little bit lower, and then there was the stage. And he said the show ended, and somehow your riser was removed, and he didn't know it, and the curtain had already closed, and he fell 3 feet.
I think that's true. And he heard it
with the missing riser.
And he hurt himself too because of that. Yeah.
So then Frank got his start.
Well, Frank Farrell was our monitor mixer and technical director. But in a previous incarnation, he was a drummer, and he played drums. Yeah. And after all these years of listening to us play, he sort of had how he would play the show in his mind. So when this was in Detroit, and Lynn injured himself and couldn't do the show, and I can't remember the opening act, but we called the drummer for the opening act and said,
they didn't want it.
Hey, can you fill in? And he said, ain't no way I'm doing that.
Yeah.
That's why I'm not going to name who it was. But Frank said, well, and then somebody called me and said, Frank's up on the drums right now, sort of rehearsing the show. I said, really? And he said, yep. So I made a line over to the venue to play just with Frank, him and me. And I said, you know what? I think this is going to work. Let's do it. And so we had Frank do the show that night in Detroit.
Yep.
Initially as just that night, it was going to be, and we called a couple other drummers in Nashville, said, can you come out and do this if we need you? And one or two of them said they could. But that night after the show, we had a meeting, and somebody said, well, should we call this guy or that guy? And I just sort of piped up and I said, you know what, to tell you the truth, we've got maybe 10 days left on this tour. Instead of working with another drummer to break him in.
Teach him everything, yeah.
Frank can do this right now. And everybody sort of looked at me like, really? And I said, yeah, he's already got all the punches down that we need. He knows
Chuck,
the show.
I think there's another reason. Selfish reason. Is because Frank used to go to all the exotic restaurants with you in every city that you went to. So he was your restaurant mate, especially at the Indian restaurants and all the restaurants that nobody knew how to order. You didn't have to teach somebody what everything was.
You know what? I think you're right. That's a really good point. Yeah.
I need to tell you this story that happened last Saturday night. We were up in Maine, and we're looking for a restaurant with another couple, and we saw an Indian restaurant. And my wife said, do you want to go to an Indian restaurant? And I said to her, I'm not going to an Indian restaurant without Chuck being with me. And that's an absolute true story. Unless Chuck, because Chuck can explain all the stuff about naan and masala and whatever, which is another interesting thing. You want to get into Zimmerman, or you want to segue into?
Well, just the last thing is that after that tour ended, and then Lynn did his tenure of, I think, 23 years or 25 years. And we auditioned a half a dozen other guys to come in and take that chair, that drum chair. And Mike Zimmerman actually came in and nailed it. And he brought it, it's funny to say, that's a youthful energy to the group. I mean, he was in his 40s, but, it's still youthful when the rest of us are in our 60s, Yeah. And so he did a great job and has done a great job throughout all the years that he was with us. I think it was 7 or 8 years, something like that, or 6 years. And he's a great addition to the group.
Although Kenny didn't know his name.
There was a funny story on the show Fox and Friends, a morning show. We did songs and everything went fine. And then we did a after show segment that was aired only on the web.
Yeah.
And the host wanted Kenny to introduce all the band members. And so he went around and introduced everybody. And he came to Mike and he said, and Mike's on drums. And they said, well, what's his last name? He said, well, it's Mike on drums. He couldn't remember Zimmerman for some reason. So Mike piped up and said, it's Mike Zimmerman. And so then the other hosts, I can't remember, one of the female hosts said, come on, Zimmerman, let's get going here. Yeah. He became famous that day on Fox and Friends.
Yeah. One of the other questions that I was going to ask you, but, I'll change it a little bit. There are days when you're in a city the day before and the show is not till the next night. And some people, just, read books or hang around, and Randy would go out and take pictures. And one of the things that you said that you enjoyed doing was sampling the local restaurants. And, talk about that, because people think that you eat exotic food every night, but basically, I mean, you could go 4 shows in a row with, rotating between turkey, chicken, and roast beef,
That's right.
at the show meal. But you adventured, and I know Frank was one of your unindicted co-conspirators on that, but talk about what you would look for in a local restaurant.
We did. We enjoyed that. In fact, at one point we said we should keep a journal of this and write a book of, of food across the nation, because in so many different cities we found unique things. And what we would sometimes do is ask the the local folks, what makes this city famous for food wise? Like in Buffalo, New York, it was, of course, buffalo wings. Well, yeah. Buffalo wings in Buffalo, New York, you can almost go in any bar and get buffalo wings, and they're going to be great. But there was one bar where they originated, called the Anchor Bar and Grill, in Buffalo. So whenever we worked Buffalo, we would always go to the Anchor Bar and Grill. And that was, I remember one time we had Ledford Heron was one of our bus drivers, and a great guy from Alabama, and as country as you could get.
Yep.
And I remember going with him one night after the show down to the Anchor Bar and Grill, and there was a few others too. And I didn't know that Ledford really wasn't big on hot, spicy food.
Was not.
And not really big on it. Now at the Anchor Bar and Grill, they had mild, medium, hot, and suicide. Those were the different types of hotness. So I said to Ledford, I said, do you like spicy? He said, well, yeah, maybe. It was like that. And I said, well, maybe we ought to get medium for you instead of mild. So we got medium. And that was so funny that Ledford had those, and he had sweat coming out of his forehead. He didn't know which end was up because it was so spicy for him. And the rest of us had either the hot or the suicide. Right. What we usually would do is we'd get the hot wings and have the suicide sauce on the side to dip it in.
Well, based on the shirt that you're wearing right now, there's significance to that shirt.
Oh, that's right. I got my hot sauce shirt on. So other cities that we went to is that when we were in New Orleans, we would always go to the what they call the Garden District, and there was a restaurant there called Pascal's Manali's. Originally, it was called Manali's, and then someone called Pascal bought it, and so it was called Pascal's Manali's. They wanted to keep the name going, and we would get a dish called barbecued shrimp, which was basically a large shrimp, almost prawn size, that was still in shell, and it would be cooked in a mainly butter broth. I mean, it was a bowl about this big, and it was almost like a soup, but it was butter. I think they had chicken stock, little chicken stock, and then several different spices that would be added to it to make this broth into a roux, I guess you'd call it. And then the shrimp would be right in that. And then so you'd have to peel those shrimp and eat them with the really terrific bread, like a French baguette kind of bread.
Yeah, beignet. Yeah.
Yeah. Now the beignet was different.
Different. Okay.
The beignet is what you have with the coffee. That's the sweet pastry type of thing, the beignet. But a baguette is like a French baguette bread. So in all the different cities, there would be different foods. In Atlanta, we'd always stop at the Varsity, which was famous for their hot dogs and hamburgers, and all the sports teams would go there, hence the name Varsity. That was always common that we would go there. And all over the nation, we'd have, of course, Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. The different fish dishes there were just unbelievable.
Now, are you primarily eating this food late at night after a show, or?
Well, what was the best time was when we had days off, as you mentioned, and to go out and have it as a normal meal. But a lot of times we would go out after the show. We were lovers of pizza generally. I mean, I especially, but all the band loved pizza, and we would oftentimes get pizza. Kenny would always get a pizza on the bus every night, but we didn't always do that. Every once in a while we would, but it was more rare that we did. Or if we were in New York, when we worked up in New York doing the Christmas play called The Toy Shop at the Beacon Theater for 6 weeks, we would always walk down to I think you might have gone with us one time to a pizza place that we frequented and get pizza and Greek salad. It was always just unbelievably great.
I remember you took me to the Cottage Restaurant, which was that Asian place right next door to the theater.
That's right.
Gave you wine. Wine was included.
That's right. It was wild. That was wild, wasn't it?
Yep. So I also know that after you would play anywhere in Maine, because of the proximity to LL Bean, and LL Bean being open 24/7, the tour bus would pull up to LL Bean at midnight, and you all would get out and, depending upon the time of the year, buy your Christmas presents for your family.
That's exactly right. And when we had rental cars, we would always do that too. But when we had the bus, you're right, we would go after the show, make the bus driver do a special trip out to LL Bean. I remember one year, I think I bought my daughter a telescope from there, believe it or not. Not what you'd normally expect to buy from LL Bean, but that's where I bought it. And but it was always you took us there one time too in your RV, I think, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun through the years, that's for sure.
Yep, Through the Years, good song. So what would you say was the biggest lesson you learned from working with Kenny that you're able to continue in your new life? And we want to talk about your new life in just a minute because the Kenny Rogers music is not going away.
That's right.
But what's the lesson? And then we'll get into it.
I've listened to some of the other interviews and what people have said, and like Bobby said, the 1 year plan, the 3 year plan, and the 5 year plan. That was a fantastic thing, but persistence, I think, and the knowledge that that you can make it and make it work, then having the persistence to do it was a trait that Kenny had, and I think all of us wanted to emulate. I know I did. I've had several different ventures. I'm not satisfied on doing one thing. So I
Yep.
developed a web development company. I do web design and graphic design and video editing and all those different things. And it's just a matter of persistence on. I think that's the biggest thing. Keep going. Don't quit. You're not gonna you have a passion for something, then take that passion and move it forward with the persistence. I think that's the best thing.
It's interesting. So, you know what? That last show on December 17th, 2017, was not scheduled to be the last show. There was no ceremony. There was none of the people from Nashville were there. There were not big press people there. Unlike that event that they had in Nashville earlier, with the big TV special, the Gamblers, with Kenny and Dolly and Lionel and Don Henley, et cetera. So everybody thought that, you know what, we're going to take the holiday break, the Christmas break, and, we got dates booked in March, April, May, out in California for, that would have been easy for you right out there because you're still living out there. So there was never a last show. So there was no closure. And there's still, even when Kenny passed during this COVID time, there still hasn't been a closure. Is that difficult for you as a band member, that you really didn't get a chance to hug Wanda or hug the kids or hug your bandmates and kind of reflect on that?
Let me touch on one thing first, and that is Kenny's passing. I don't know that it's really honestly sunk in 100%. I mean, obviously the reality is that I won't see him again in the flesh. I'm a believer that we go on, so I don't have any question on that. But you don't have that physical comm line. You don't have that physical person to say hi to, and who is through the decades have become not just my boss but a friend. So I still have a somewhat unresolved grief, I guess is a good way to say it.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm not a big fan of funerals, but the Catholic faith that has a very strict procedure that they do on a mass for someone who's passed. And I've gone to several of them with my wife's family, and I realized the last one was my mother-in-law. It's a procedure. It's you go through these steps, and at the end you have a relief, and you feel like you go through the steps of the mass, the Catholic mass, and at the end you feel like, well, they've gone on and they'll be fine, and yeah, we'll learn to be fine with it. But we didn't have that with Kenny's passing, and I know Wanda, who we're still close with, very close, and is a wonderful person. I honestly credit Wanda with Kenny's resurgence success in the late 90s and early 2000s. She's just what Kenny needed at the time, and always was supportive of him. But Wanda had planned to have a get-together on Kenny's birthday tomorrow, actually. But the COVID thing just was put too much mystery into what we would do, how we would get together, that she postponed that. I'm still confident that we will have a get-together where we can honor his life and share stories that I think help bring closure. So I don't want to go on and on about that, but I did want to mention that it's still is still there, and but okay. I forget what the rest of the question was, so I'm sorry.
Well, no, just about the closure, about no people, but it leads me to my next point here is, Kenny is gone, but the music lives on, and it's something that you're instrumental. Get this, Chuck. You're instrumental in. Talk about this Kenny Rogers band through the years, because that is something that I'm really looking forward to.
Well, it's interesting through when before Kenny passed and we were still on the road, we had in our off time talked about, well, when Kenny ends off, you'd think maybe we should put together something to continue the legacy of Kenny's music and honor him in that way. And everybody sort of said, yeah, it's a good idea, but nobody wanted to take the mantle and run with it, you know, take the harness and take over.
Because I was going to play Kenny.
Huh?
I was going to play Kenny. I was going to be Kenny.
That's right. So in early 2019, 2018 just sort of went, and everybody just sort of said, what happened? You know,
What happened? Yep.
and before you knew it, 2018 was over. In early 2019, I think it was somewhere in the first quarter of 2019, I got a phone call from Don Gatlin. And Don Gatlin had a group, and still does, called Savannah Jack. And he had written a few songs for Kenny that Kenny had recorded on albums. And one time in the studio, he said to Kenny, Kenny said to Don, hey, what are you doing next month? I think it was. And Don says, well, I don't know. What do you mean? He said, well, we're going to the UK, and maybe you and the guys would come over and be our opening act. And Don was like, huh, what? So it ended up being that Don and the Savannah Jack group, the three of them, came over and was our opening act for the whole UK tour. And then that expanded. They ended up doing over 66 concerts where they were the opening act for Kenny. And so Don called me up early 2019 and said, you know, Chuck, I've been a huge Kenny Rogers fan for since I was a kid. And I know every song on every album that he ever did. And I would just love it if we could do something where I could sing with the Kenny Rogers band, the actual band. And he said, you know, I told him, you know, we thought about having something like that, but nobody knew who would take up the mantle and drive it forward. So he said, well, why don't you do that? And so he and I collaborated, and I talked to the other guys in the group, and they were actually into it, which I was somewhat surprised at. And
well, you know, let me stop you there for 1 second, because the thing that I've found in talking to all the guys so far is that they all said, look, this was more than just a group of guys that worked together. We still stay in touch 3 years later after the last show. So it's not surprising that they would say yes, because there seems to be a bond with you guys that probably doesn't exist with other musical organizations.
I think that's very true. And there's probably a primary reason for that is when you look around at groups that are touring, very seldom do you find ones that have the same personnel year after year.
Yep.
They even if they toured all year with the same personnel, at the end of the year, it would end off and it'd say, see you later. And it would sort of break up. And then if, let's say April, May, they start up another tour, they would put together another band. It wouldn't always be the same people, you know? And Kenny's thing was different in that way, because I think I mentioned this before, in all candor, Kenny didn't like to rehearse. And so having the same band was advantageous to him, because you know, the same guys come together and know the songs, you know. So he decided early on that, you know, let's just keep everybody on the same pay scale. I mean, early on we were paid whether we worked or not, just a straight salary. And then it developed later years in the 90s where we were paid like a retainer, and then we were paid per show. So it equaled about the same as if we were paid a salary. And then later on, where there wasn't as much money flowing from the concerts, we would just get paid when we worked. And that was fine too, but it was all the same people, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that was why it developed a close bond. Now, obviously, we spent a lot of time together, and that develops a bond, but also because you're still on the group payroll, as it were, you know, you're all a part of that group. And it developed. So when I called all the rest of the guys, they said, yeah, let's get together and do something. So I needed to figure out first thing was we needed to have a performance. We had to play somewhere. and then hopefully videotape it, so we'd have a promotional video and that type of stuff, which we have at KennyRogersBand.com if anybody wanted to see it. So we did a show at the Dells in Wisconsin, a famous resort area. A friend of mine was managing the theater up there, and I called him and I said, what we need is a place we can rehearse for a little bit, for a couple of days, do a show, and have a place that has a hotel or something nearby. He said, I've got just the place, ours theater, and we have a hotel, and we can serve you food because it's a dinner theater. So it was perfect. And we organized that. And I said, we don't need a lot of money, just some money for expenses. And he said, consider it done. And so we organized the show date in September of 2019 and did that show. And although it wasn't a full house, because it was sort of like last minute, the people that did come just loved it. In fact, if you go to KennyRogersBand.com, you'll see a promo video at the end of which are people that were there giving their testimonials, and they just loved it. And so because of that, then we talked with different agents, and we had several bookings in this year that were scheduled that I really thought would come off. But as we've seen, this pandemic thing has just been pervasive, and what you thought would continue have been canceled, or in our case have been postponed to like we have.
Well, the beauty of it is that it has been postponed, so the dates are coming up whenever we can get back to any sense of normal. But the fact that you asked every member of the band and they all said yes is kind of remarkable, because usually when you look at reunion tours, there's always a couple defections.
Yeah, that's right. Or people say, I'll not play with him till hell freezes over. You remember
exactly.
that? Remember that story about the hell freezes over Eagles tour? That was
right, and then it was their hell freezes over tour. Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. Talk quickly about so you're going to be starting, but our last topic, Kenny and Don Henley. Talk about that relationship, because a lot of people don't know.
Yeah. Well, Kenny, of course, was born in Houston and came from Texas, and Don Henley was from Texas as well. And when Kenny was the first edition, he had his home in Los Angeles area, and he always had a penchant for and a talent for producing music. Getting in the studio, assembling people, and putting things together for a group. So Don Henley was with a group in Texas, the name of which I can't remember right now, and he called Don Henley and said, "Hey, I want you guys to come out, and I want to produce some records, some sides on you," what they call sides, meaning certain number of songs. And so they did. Kenny came out and produced several songs on Don Henley and the group he was with, and they were moderately successful. And Kenny at that time had a publishing company and had several songs that Don Henley had written under his publishing company. What that means is that you sign a artist or a songwriter to a contract that when a song gets recorded, your publishing company represents them. Okay. And so then what happens is each of them get paid a certain amount of money. So at one point, so that was moderately successful, and they developed a good relationship. But later, a few years later, Don came to Kenny and said, "Hey, listen, I'm getting together with this group, and it's a new group called the Eagles. And one of the things that has been a little sticking point is that I have some songs that were with you as a publisher that I sort of would like to get back under my full ownership. Is there any way that I could ask you to release me from the publishing contract that we have?" And Kenny's like this forever, He said, without hesitation, he said, "Yeah, no problem." And those songs were like songs like Desperado and some other songs that became gigantic hits, as we know. And Kenny would have realized a lot of money from, but Kenny had a theory of, I'll give you all of my past and none of my future, So if that was the past, and he just let it go. He had a really good attitude about that.
Yep. Wow. So Chuck, we have gone way over what we anticipated, but I looked at the clock and then I said, wow, look where we are here. the future is not in the past. The future is in the future, like you just said. And I know you're excited. I mean, everybody in the band is excited. You know, let's get rolling again. Let's get rolling again. We talked with Gatlin the other day, and he's got one of these segments up here. I don't know even know if you know that. But
no, I didn't know you talked with
we did a Gatlin thing, and
I want to mention something before we end off. That
sure.
This Monday we're going to actually go in a studio in Nashville and do a live stream video of the show, sort of an edited down video of the show for a county fair in northern Michigan. In fact, Edgar, being from northern Michigan, was contacted by this county fair and said, you know, we can't do a live county fair, but we want to do a virtual one. And we want to see if maybe we could have, as an entertainment, have the Kenny Rogers Band do their show. So we organized that, and we're going to go in the studio on Monday and record that. That ought to be a lot of fun.
Yep. And then I guess there's the Christmas album in the offing as well, right?
That's right. We've recorded a Christmas album. On Randy's interview, he talks about how that occurred. And Don did a wonderful job on that. That's going to be released this year at Christmas time. And in fact, we have another studio version of a performance in December with a promoter up in Long Island, that we're going to do a version of the Christmas show where we'll do hits and then we'll do Christmas songs.
Yeah.
And in that one, of course, we'll be promoting that Christmas CD.
Okay. So Chuck, it has been a pleasure talking with you. You know, we've known each other for many, many years, and I heard things today that I hadn't heard before. And it's always nice to see your smiling face and to know that the music of Kenny Rogers is going to live on through you and the hard work that you've done and all the other bandmates that we've had the opportunity to talk to. And with that being said, we want to tell everybody that we've been talking with Chuck Jacobs, and he's excited about the future. If you like this one, hit that red button down in the bottom right and subscribe to it. And every new segment that we do, we've got Don Gatlin done, we've got Frank Farrell done, we've got Lynn Hammond done, Bobby's done, Edgar's done, Bucky Harris, the shortest tenure with Kenny is done. And you know what? There's so many there. Mike Zimmerman and Mike Denny, the bus driver. Chuck, here's the interesting thing. You've got some work to do because Mike Denny, the bus driver, has got the most views on all of his gifts, all of his segments so far. So you've got to promote it to beat him.
Yeah, absolutely. That's terrific. Well, let me just say thank you very much for the opportunity for doing this, John. I know I said earlier that I think it's a valuable thing that you're doing, and keep at it.
Great. Have a great day, everybody.
All right.